My name, here we my name is Tiffany Marcantonio, and just briefly from a background stance, I'm originally from New Jersey, born and raised. And in New Jersey, I did a bachelor's and a master's degree in psychology, and I was actually a licensed clinical therapist for a year after that, before I went back to school for my PhD. My famous line these days is that I've been doing the Southern tour. So I did my PhD in community health promotion at the University of Arkansas, and then some fellowship training at Indiana University. And now I'm currently at the University of Alabama, where I'm in the public health department there and work with amazing students like Alex on sexual violence prevention and intervention. And so today, though, we're going to talk a bit about consent. And so just because I recognize that there can be a variety of people in the audience who have a different maybe background, understanding of what consent is, I wanted to go over some of the basics first. So just to begin, I thought I'd give a definition of consent. And to be honest, there's actually not one agreed upon definition when we think about sexual consent. So I'm going to use the one, I'm going to tell you all about the one that I tend to use the most often when I'm doing research on this topic. Also throughout the presentation, sometimes I have QR codes included. Those just link you to different research articles if you wanted to read more after. So the definition of consent that I tend to use a lot is one's freely given verbal or nonverbal communication of their unimpaired feelings of willingness to engage in a particular sexual behavior with a particular person within a particular context. And here I've kind of highlighted different things throughout this definition. So to begin, we've underlined it freely given because the idea is that consent should not occur under coercion, pressure, or duress. But also the idea that consent is both verbal and nonverbal. So while yes, we always want to strive for young people to use, that open, direct communication of maybe saying yes or asking if you want to have sex, we do want to acknowledge that there is plenty of nonverbal cues people use that are understood and interpreted as sexual consent. Also, the concept of an unimpaired feeling of willingness is really important. And this is tapping into, from the unimpaired perspective, about the idea that substances have a role in this. And that what we'll talk about a bit today is that it seems that when we think about substance and consent, people tend to think about this as being unimpaired or sober enough, but not that they have to have no alcohol in their system. And we'll talk a bit more about that. Consent also involves a feeling of willingness. So while it's an outward behavior, that behavior is typically coming from a feeling inside of me. And finally, to what Alex talked about today, is the back of this definition talks about a particular behavior, person, and context. And that's the idea that consent is highly contextual. And so it really does change and alter depending on who we're with, what behavior we're consenting to, and the larger context around there. So just to briefly highlight some of the different ways that people communicate consent, I wanted to review that here. So first off, people can communicate consent through an explicit verbal cue. And this is what we typically think about as saying yes to sexual activity. It's these typical direct, clear verbal indicators. Do you want to have sex with me? Are you okay with this? That people can use to communicate consent. Consent can be also communicated through what's called implicit verbal cues. And these are verbal phrases or statements that are suggestive of sex, but don't use the word. So maybe something like, do you want to move upstairs? Do you want to move to the bedroom? And sometimes I make the joke of, do you want to Netflix and chill? As these different verbal phrases that suggest sex, but don't actually use that word. Outside of these implicit and explicit verbal cues people can use, they can also use nonverbal cues. So explicit nonverbal cues are kind of these direct behaviors that someone can do to communicate consent. And this could be things like taking off my clothes, pulling out a condom, grabbing lubricant. And these are all signs that people say communicate consent. Now, similar to verbal, we also have an implicit nonverbal cue. And implicit nonverbal cues, these are more subtle, suggestive nonverbal behaviors people can do. This is things that we might hear about, like sexy eyes or suggestive eyes people do that communicate consent. And then finally, there's a cue that gets a little tricky, and this is called no response. And no response is the idea that you don't, someone initiates sexual activity and in not refusing or stopping that behavior from happening, that's someone's consent. So here in this GIF, we can see he kind of leans in and kisses her, and in her not refusing it, some young people would say that that is consent. And so now I'm going to turn this over to Alex to talk a bit about the different contexts that could be occurring here.
Right. So context in the context of a casual encounter. Let's get going. So nonverbal consent can equally be as powerful as verbal consent, but casual relationships make it extremely situational. And it's important to know that verbal consent is less likely to occur in these casual encounters. These relationships can look very different based on gender and can also be impacted by social pressure as well. So for men, they tend to look for verbal refusal only, but most students expect men to actually elicit consent themselves. And for women who have high sexual assertiveness, they tend to communicate more and they are at a lower risk of sexual victimization. But then likewise, women with low assertiveness are less likely to participate in consent behavior, even if they have a high sexual want. Now, influences of social pressure can impact the likelihood to express sexual assertiveness as well. So we see this in the college setting. Here at UA, we have a lot of Greek events and date parties and whatnot. And oftentimes, especially if you go with somebody who you have a sexual history with, even just saying yes to those events can kind of have an underlying lay of, I'm going to go home with you tonight and I'm consenting to sex just by saying yes to coming to this event. So women have reported consenting to an encounter because they feel that they needed to satisfy their partner or it was too far along in the interaction despite them not wanting to. So they already went home with their date from the date party and here they are in the bedroom and they feel like it's too late to say no at that point. So challenges when discussing consent in a casual encounter can be difficult because again, consent is so contextual. And the fact is that research is just needed, or research is needed to divulge the sexual script of quote hookup culture, especially in non-heterosexual relations. So the intricacy of social relationships makes it hard to define consent in all situations. Casual encounters tend to be less verbal, but this is also dependent on the behavior and the context. So we discussed, the setting of the date party and versus going home with somebody from the bar, that relationship might be a little bit different. Nonverbal communication can be effective, but again, say you don't know the person, you came home from the bar with them, your communication might be a little bit different than somebody that you've been with the entire evening or went to an actual event with together, things like that. And social pressure and gender roles can influence how willing people are to refuse as well. So say you have a Hercules standing in front of you, might be a little bit intimidated to say no. And the way people can report varies because sexual behaviors can be super ambiguous to different people. So I know it's not a clear-cut answer as to what consent looks like in a casual relationship, but it's important to understand and be empathetic when you are in these situations. So researchers have kind of divulged sort of a 4-point plan as to how to promote consent in a casual encounter. And these points are comprehensive sex education, more participatory and skills-based education, changes in alcohol and substance policy to reduce the harm of drunk sex, and space planning to build safer campuses.
Yeah, thank you, Alex.
So thank you.
Now, building off of this, so recognizing that in a casual encounter, consent can look different because of the fact that people are not as familiar with one another and that gender has a role with this. And well, I think when I think about casual encounters or hookup culture and just broadly contextual factors that influence consent, we have to think about alcohol in it as well. And so broadly speaking, we generally know that alcohol complicates sexual consent communication. And really this complication comes in because so many sexual assaults occur in the context of alcohol use. And that's where we really start to see this conversation about well, if alcohol increases the risk for sexual violence to happen, then how do you discuss alcohol and consent together when alcohol complicates all of this so much? And broadly speaking, prevention education has been pretty hesitant to discuss the role that alcohol has in sexual violence prevention or in sexual violence, but in particular with consent. And the reason for that is a lot of universities have rules and policies that just say that alcohol and consent cannot occur together. Most schools have a zero tolerance policy where if someone is drinking, the automatic statement is that, consent can't be given after that. However, that's not true in the sense that many young people report that they perceive they engaged in consensual sexual activity after they were drinking. And in fact, in a national study, 1 in 6 women and 1 in 5 men reported that they or their partner was drunk at their most recent consensual encounter. So while we say that young people can't do this, they are having lived experiences that suggest that they can. And what happens is it actually results in ineffective messaging. That instead of listening to us or hearing us, a lot of times young people tend to just tune us out when it comes to this conversation, because all they hear is that they can't do it when they have experiences that suggest that they can do it. And as Alex talked about, that I'm going to really drill home at the end of this today, is that in addition to the fact that we don't have maybe the best messaging around alcohol and consent, we also just lack the science when it comes to this. It's difficult to inform prevention when we don't know the science to do that. We've been studying sexual violence for nearly 50 years. And despite all of that research, we still don't have the best answers to the questions that are being asked. And so broadly speaking, we just need more science still to keep informing us on what this looks like so prevention can take action from there. So I have a couple big questions that I want to talk about today with you all. And this is usually the first one that I get asked from people when thinking about alcohol, which is, how does alcohol actually impact how consent's communicated? And so what does that look like? Well, as a shocker to, I think, a lot of us, myself included, when I first started doing this work, is that we're actually not seeing an effect of substance use on consent communication. Now, I want to put a caveat into all of this here, that a lot of work that has looked at the role that alcohol has with consent ends up looking at people who are in either more monogamous or at least more familiar relationships. And the reason for that is that if you're trying to look at how consent changes over time, it means that you need people who are having sex regularly. And people who are having sex regularly means that they might be in a more steady, long-term monogamous relationship. So while I'm going to talk about some of this today with alcohol and consent, I do want to put that caveat in there. There are a lot of this is done within the context of a more established relationship. So what we're seeing right now, though, from the preliminary work that's out there, is not an impact. So it doesn't seem that from one study they found didn't change how people communicated their consent to different sexual behaviors over the course of a month. But what the researchers did find, that as to be part of this study, was that the more drinks someone had consumed prior to sexual activity, they saw that they were having less explicit and more implicit communication. And that kind of makes sense, right? If I'm consuming more drinks, if I'm having more cannabis in my system, we know that those effects can make it difficult to do complex behaviors like verbal consent. And so we're seeing more of that implicit communication occurring the more intoxicated someone becomes. However, in a different study that I recently just did with some colleagues, we actually found that active consent communication, which in this case is considered both verbal and nonverbal, implicit and explicit cues, just using a variety of cues, was actually positively associated with situations that involve substances. So we saw that people were being basically more communicative when their sexual experiences involved alcohol than when they didn't. So really what we have here is almost the opposite occurring, which is that using substances that associate potentially with more communication. Some of this could be coming from liquid courage too. So the idea that, like drinking makes me feel a little more courageous to be forward with the things that I want. And so that could be what's happening here. And again, it could also be that these are maybe people who are more comfortable with one another. Finally, what I wanted to highlight today with all of you was that I actually just finished a data collection. These results are not published yet. But what we did is we asked people to recall a sexual experience in the past year that they consented to when they were sober, and then a sexual experience that they consented to when they were drinking or intoxicated. And then we looked to see if their consent communication differed across these two different sexual experiences. And similar to what I just highlighted with you, we found that straightforward cues, so those direct cues that we like to see, maybe asking, saying yes, they were more often being used when people were intoxicated. And we are seeing subtle and nonverbal cues used more often when people were sober. So again, this pattern seems to be happening, at least from some preliminary work, that maybe when people are mixing alcohol with consent, they're maybe being more forward or more direct in their communication. Potentially because of some of the efforts that we're all doing in the field, right? That we're talking about the role that alcohol has with this. We're having conversations about this. People know alcohol can make consent more complicated. And so because of that, potentially they're having more open conversations about it. So maybe based on what we're seeing right now, alcohol doesn't change how we consent. So do people think that they can though? So maybe it's not changing how I communicate, but do I think that I can consent when I'm intoxicated? Well, this is a question that we also asked. And so what we did actually a couple years ago was that we went out to sporting events where people were drinking, and we interviewed intoxicated tailgaters about their perceptions of their ability to consent based on how drunk they were in that moment. So based on how you're feeling right now, do you think you can consent to sexual activity? And overwhelmingly, people reported to us that they could. People felt that despite how intoxicated they were in that moment, they felt that they could still consent to sexual activity. We took it a step further because we thought, okay, maybe you think you can consent. But if somebody was here right now that wanted to have sex with you, would you leave with this person to go and have sex with them? Was another question that we asked. And overnight and overwhelmingly, also people reported they would leave, and that they did feel comfortable to consent to sex. And this is all with an average breath alcohol content of 0.08. At the level of 0.08, you might have some motor impairment happening. You might have some difficulty with cognition, maybe like staying on track with a conversation. You might find that you're easily distracted. Here, you could also be feeling some like elevated mood, happiness, changes in behavior, feelings, maybe feeling more relaxed. And so, despite maybe feeling some of these effects of alcohol, people overwhelmingly thought that they could still consent to sex and that they would consent if they had the opportunity. Now, we were curious about what people thought for others, though, not just themselves in this study. So these people were actually interviewed in dyads, and we asked them about the person that they were here with today and if they thought that that person could consent. And more often, the dyads were just friends with one another and typically same gender. So we had groups that were just two groups of men and groups that were just two groups of women. And across that, we did overwhelmingly see that people did say that they thought that their friends could consent to sex. So again, not only that I think I can consent, but they also perceive that their friends could consent as well. But there was one important gender difference here that I want to highlight. When we asked men about each other, men were more likely to say that the other person could go home with someone, their friends could consent. And when we asked them why, they said things like, well, I'm not really worried about him. He's a big guy. He can do what he wants. He's a grown man. It's not my choice to decide when he can and can't have sex. With women, though, they weren't so confident in that. Women first brought up to us when they said, like, why wouldn't you let somebody leave? They talked about the risk for sexual violence and recognizing that that was an ever-present option or experience that could happen to them. They talked also about regret, that they didn't want their friend to regret something the next morning. And that they also said that even though they thought their friend could, they weren't completely sure about that. And because they weren't totally sure, they didn't feel good about letting them leave. And so here we see some gender differences, right? In the sense that women are more hesitant potentially for their friends to let them go home with someone when they're intoxicated, but we do not see that same hesitancy for men. So alcohol might not change how I communicate consent. And broadly speaking, people don't seem to see it as something that would really stop them from consenting, but it might be something that triggers to them or it says to them maybe their friends can't consent. So given all of this, the question that I often ask myself is, how are people navigating this then? So we're seeing that you are communicating consent. You feel confident to do so. So then, like, what does that actually mean? How are you navigating a sexual experience that involves alcohol and determining that this is consensual for you and this other person involved in the moment? And so I've asked a lot of young people this. I've done some interview studies. I'm going to highlight some quotes from that. But I also want to present you some things that we've been seeing from pretty recent stuff published in just the past couple of years, where we interview young people about how they're navigating alcohol and consent together. And so first off, I want to highlight that across all the studies that have been done, and including work that I've done myself, people tend to start this conversation with it's complicated. I don't think I've interviewed a single person nor read a study that starts off with people going like, oh, this is an easy thing to do, or I'm not worried about this, or this is pretty simple. Instead, I more often hear from young people that it's quite complicated and that there's concerns for a variety of things. Am I being pushy? Are they actually agreeing to the sex that they say they want? And are they sober enough to agree to me? And so people, broadly speaking, young people tend to already be operating from a place that this is complicated to begin with. Following up the fact that it's complicated, I often hear and read about the idea of sober in like quotations here, with this idea that like having a few drinks or feeling some of the effects of alcohol is okay to consent. But there is a line here. There is a point when people are too intoxicated to consent. And how people seem to determine this is by how lucid or aware someone is of the encounter, how lucid and aware they are of it. And then I do often hear from young people too, and I read this in studies as well, that there's something about being on the same intoxication level that suggests that this can work. So when there's a discrepancy between people, and I think we often hear about is maybe like a woman who's too intoxicated and a man who's more sober, that seems to be something that people aren't okay with, that discrepancy is problematic and it suggests like assaultive behaviors. But something about the idea that if you're both on the same level, it makes this more okay or acceptable. Now, the question I always ask myself is, how does someone determine that you are on the same level? And I'll be honest, I've asked young people this and they don't really have a great answer themselves. But that seems to be a running theme that we hear about this. Finally, I often hear young people and read about this too, talk about their own set of sort of like rules and norms for how people navigate alcohol and consent together. I actually typically call this like harm reduction moves. I think that young people are engaging in harm reduction when it comes to alcohol and consent. And typically the stuff that I see from people that they'll say to me is that they have a number of drinks in their mind of like what they can drink before they think consent's not possible. And typically this is anywhere between 2 to 3 drinks seems to be the running theme that I hear, that 2 to 3 drinks and I think I'm okay to consent. Anything more than that and it starts to get questionable about, if I can comprehend, if the other person can comprehend and really know what's happening. Outside of number of drinks, I also hear about types of drinks as well, which I think is interesting. Young people tend to say that they prefer to do like beer and seltzer as like in terms of drinking before sex compared to like liquor. And why I hear that is that typically people say things that because beer and seltzers, one, tend to be lower alcohol. So a lot of young people are drinking like Bud Light, Budweisers, typically at the 5% alcohol, or seltzers that are typically between 5 and 6%. So they can recognize kind of how much alcohol they're taking in, and that there's almost to a degree like a volume thing. There's only so many beers you can put down, so many seltzers you can put down before feeling full, there's just a lot of volume in the liquid. Compared to, let's say, shots. Lots of people have brought up the conversation that like shots can be really problematic for alcohol and consent. And the first thing that people tend to say is that one, you could put so much more alcohol down quickly, and that can be problematic. But that two, liquor, when you're taking shots, it could take a bit to hit you. So someone could take a bunch of shots, go out, be talking with somebody, and then a little bit later in the night, that alcohol starts to set in. And because of that lag effect there, it can make it more difficult. And in fact, when I think about types of drinks, I interviewed this young person and he's telling me about how his freshman year at college, him and his friends would go out every weekend and they would take all these shots, they would black out, they would have sex with women, they'd wake up the next morning and none of them could remember any of it. They don't know how they got there, they don't remember how they got home, they don't even remember who they left with or the person who they wake up with next to. And this apparently was going on for this group of individuals for a period of time. And during our interview together, this young man says that eventually him and his friends got together and said that they were kind of fed up with this, that they didn't like not remembering their sexual experiences, that it didn't really feel great to them. They didn't really love the relationships they were having with women, that it was problematic. And so together as a group, they actually decided that they weren't going to drink liquor anymore at parties, and they were only going to stick with beer. And since then, he had said to me that they hadn't blacked out, they hadn't had these issues, they remembered the sex that they were having, and they were enjoying their time more often. And so when I think to myself about like a harm reduction stance, I think to myself, like, that could be really impactful for young people, right? Like, sure, hearing from me as an educator about ways to do this could be helpful, but maybe hearing the way that your peers are trying to navigate alcohol and consent together and safer ways to do this could be really impactful as well. Finally, I've had some young people talk to me about this idea of like ability to think clearly for how they determine they can consent to sex after drinking. And I have heard some like really creative things from people. One student told me that she keeps a set of math problems on her phone, and she has to be able to answer a set of math problems if she wants to go and consent to sex. She feels if she can't solve a math problem, then she probably can't make a judgment call about consent. I've had other people tell me that they try to think about like something they learned in class as something to help them like think clear, like can I recall what was discussed in lecture on Friday? And if I can't remember this right now, then I probably can't consent to sex in this moment. And so people are trying to find these ways that they can think more clearly or kind of gauge how intoxicated they are before they're engaging in sexual activity. So broadly speaking, just different harm reduction things that young people are trying to do to make this safer for themselves and others. Now, the final thing that comes up in thinking about this talk today in context is that when people talk about navigating alcohol and consent, relationship comes up a lot. I would actually argue that it's probably the most prevalent theme that I've seen for both the work that I do, but also the work that I read from other people. Who someone is dating, who someone is talking to, this is really how it seems like young people are determining that they can consent to sex after they've been drinking. And so what I want to do here is I interviewed about 30 young adults about all of this and present to you all some quotes that they have said to me during that time, particularly within the context of relationship status, though. So first, here's a quote from a young woman here. If you're in a relationship, I think that's okay. If you've known, if you've been with, if you've had sexual activity with this person before, and you've both been drinking around the same amount and hanging out, or out throughout the night, and you give consent, I think that's okay. So here you can see that this young woman's talking about this idea about you've known each other, you might have had sexual activity before. And then again, there's that comment about drinking the same amount of alcohol. That can make alcohol and consent okay. And here, this young man highlights a pretty similar point. And I feel, me personally, I don't usually just go home with random girls at the end of the night too. So usually if I'm hooking up with a girl, it's somebody that I have a connection with and know that, and know some form of connection somehow. And so what I want to highlight here is that while both of these are talking about a connection, a relationship, and maybe the quote from the woman talks more about perhaps like thinking about like a boyfriend or a hookup partner or a girlfriend, the person on the right is just broadly talking about a connection with them. And he did go on to talk about the fact that even just being like a classmate, a friend of a friend, someone that you know, someone that you've interacted with, you've seen at a couple parties. So it's this idea that there's something about having a little bit of familiarity with one another that can make alcohol and consent more okay, or at least a little bit safer. I'm going to highlight a couple more quotes from some other people here. So here's a quote from a young man. So if you know the person, I think it's much easier. Like you can tell their drunk tendencies. And when they're way too gone, or when they're just in a good party mood type of deal, they're like in a good drunk. So I think it's just kind of like, from prior history. And here, I really like this quote because it highlights something that I think is important. First off, it just highlights this idea about like knowing a person, having a prior relationship with them, but not just knowing them, knowing this person when they're intoxicated. And I think that's really valuable. Here, this young man highlights this idea about recognizing someone's drunk tendencies, right? When someone's had too much to drink or when they're in a good party mood. And I think that's kind of difficult to navigate if you don't have some familiarity with the person you're with, right? If you've never gotten drunk with someone before, then you probably don't know what drunk looks like for them. And so here, I think it's really important that when we're thinking about the contexts of when consent and alcohol is occurring, it's not just a prior sexual relationship. It might even be a prior drunk relationship, and that you two have been drinking together before and maybe know each other's drunk behaviors as well. Here's a quote from a young woman. Yeah, so this is like, I don't know if I can say this, but a while ago, I was in a relationship and we went out to parties, just like a get together with our friends. And because I was in that relationship, it felt like it was already consensual. But every time you have sex or whatever, you still have to consent, obviously. But I feel like with that trust, it's kind of like mutual and like we're kind of on the same page when we're drinking. So first, I think here for her quote, I want to highlight that as an educator, as a researcher in this, I'm very mindful that young people have a lot of shame around this. She opens up her conversation with me with the idea that she's not sure she can say this to me. She's not sure if what she's about to say is wrong. And I think that that's problematic. We want young people to tell us about this so we can design prevention and intervention. If they think that we're going to judge them, if they think that we're going to shame them, if they think that we're going to tell them that what they're doing is wrong, they're not going to want to talk to us then. And so I just want to start off by highlighting that she opens up with that hesitancy and fear that she's about to tell me something that I'm going to judge her on. So when she moves past that, she starts to talk about the idea that something about having that prior relationship is important to her. But what I think is really valuable here that I've seen across when speaking with young people is the idea of trust. People are trying to figure out, can they trust the person in front of them? And by having an established relationship with them, inherently there's some trust there. But what I saw a lot of young people talk about when they were talking about alcohol and consent in a casual encounter was that they wanted time to talk to the person. They wanted to feel them out further. And while originally that might be thought of as feeling them out to see if you like them, and I do think that's part of it, I think they're also feeling them out to see if they can trust them, if they're able to gauge that they're a safe person who's not going to do harm to them. Now, I think this all gets complicated because they're drinking, I'm drinking, and I think the judgment is impaired when we're drinking. But these are the things that young people are talking about doing with one another. So what are ways that this gets challenged? I'm going to present two final quotes to you here from young men that I think, despite the things that I've just talked about for these rules, these norms, the way that young people are trying to navigate this, it's really just kind of a flawed system, unfortunately. So here a young man goes, yeah, I'd say, so if you're with a girl and, oh, she's had 3 drinks, can she consent or not? Obviously, it depends on the girl. So I don't think there's just a threshold where it's consensual or not consensual. So I opened up with talking about the idea that, like, young people say something about drink numbers, like 2 to 3 drinks seems to make it okay for consent. But here this young man goes that, well, that's not totally true. It's really dependent. Like maybe those 3 drinks really, get somebody drunk. Maybe they haven't eaten all day. Maybe they're having a bad day. And so this idea that we set up some of these rules, but these rules really don't apply in every situation. And so it's really tough to follow them. Here's a quote from a young man here who talks about what I think are some really just interesting points when thinking about this. I think then it comes down to, like, they could be blacked out, and that's when they're not 100% like conscious of what they're doing. It could be one of those things like you wake up and you regret it, and you can withdraw consent even if you've already had sex or something, you can still withdraw consent. So that's a big thing, is making sure they're in a position to where, like, even the next day, the consent is still there. It's not like, oh, I was way too drunk. I did not want this to happen. You should have known I was way too drunk, that kind of thing. Yeah, it doesn't make it okay. It's not safe for them. It's not really safe for you. It's just kind of can potentially become a sticky situation. So you're just trying to avoid that. And here, I think this young man really, in one quote, capitalizes all of the issues with alcohol and consent. So the idea that someone can black out and not remember what's happening around them or not be fully conscious, that you could wake up and potentially regret sex, or that you could wake up and realize that this wasn't consensual. That consent can be withdrawn at any point of a sexual encounter. And what I really like is that he highlights that I think the key takeaway from this is that to the next day, the consent is still there. And that was a running theme for him through the conversation, was that he wanted to make sure that when he was with a sexual partner, that it wasn't just consent in this moment, but that they would wake up tomorrow and still think this was a consensual encounter. And for him, that was very important to make sure that they were working, like having this open conversation, because he didn't want someone to wake up and feel like they were being taken advantage of the next day. And then I think he finishes it with something that I think about a lot. It's not safe for them, and it's not really safe for you. So this is like a pretty tough situation. And broadly speaking, we're not doing a great job preparing young people for it, and we're putting them potentially in continuous risky and tough situations. And so that's why I think this work is so important, so that we can help people to navigate these ones in better, safer ways. As this young man highlights, there's a lot of challenges to navigating alcohol and consent. So what do I think is next after all of this? Well, across this conversation, I do want to highlight that a focus has been really on how I consent. A lot of these people have talked about, like, the ways that they navigate consent, even in a casual encounter, thinking about how someone gives consent to a to a partner. But what I've really started to think about, particularly from a sexual violence prevention stance, is how do I interpret consent? We're starting to say there's a little bit of an issue with interpretation here. And then to complicate that even more, how do you interpret consent when you're intoxicated? And to complicate that even more, as Alex highlighted too, how do you interpret consent when you're intoxicated with a new partner versus an established one? Because the reality is that the longer we're with each other, the better we get at reading nonverbal cues. The newer we are with one another, the harder that is. And that's not even including alcohol yet in the mix. And so kind of when I think about this all, we need more information and more science to answer these questions so that we can inform prevention better. Now, I do want to say that, like, I recognize that for a room maybe full of people who maybe do education in this area or prevention in this area, that's not the most satisfying answer to be given. And so what can you do until the science catches up? So first off, I would be honest with young people. I do not engage in the narrative anymore about the fact that you can't do this. I typically go up with the narrative of it's complicated. And then what I really try to do is listen to young people. We see right now that a big critique about sexual violence intervention prevention is that young people feel as out of touch with them. It does not reflect their experiences. It does not properly prepare them for what sex actually looks like, particularly what a sexual assault looks like. And so what I think we need to be doing better is being honest with people that this is hard and there aren't easy answers. And let's talk about this. You know, in interviewing 30 people about consent and alcohol, at the end of that interview, I asked them each time, you know, like, is there anything else you want me to know before we close out today? And the majority of the group tell me that they want to thank me, that they have never had the opportunity to talk about alcohol and consent. They have never had a chance to vocalize or think through the ways they navigate this. And that while they recognize that, like, I benefit from this data, they really benefited interpersonally from this, that it left them with a lot to think about moving forward. So I think just giving young people a chance to talk through this would just be beneficial. I also wanted to highlight there are 3 different initiatives. None of these are perfect. I don't think that they're, you know, potentially as encompassing or where they need to be yet, but there are a couple different initiatives that are happening right now. So UC Davis has a brief program that's basically small vignettes and people can answer questions and figure out about consent and alcohol that could be helpful. Safe Party is kind of like a flow chart. It lays out like, if this, then this, if this, then that. I think it's another way that you can provide education on consent and alcohol. And then UT Austin did a media campaign for consent and alcohol. And that's these 2 images over here. And while not necessarily an educational platform, it does give you at least some insights about ways maybe you can like display or show this. That might be a little more like realistic in matching young people's lived experiences. Finally, I would be remiss if that I didn't talk about ChatGPT for a second. And the reason that I bring this up is that because we are living in a politically hostile time towards sexual health, reproductive health, LGBTQ rights. And I do think that ChatGPT can provide an opportunity for those who do not have access or can't get access to sexual health information education. And so I asked ChatGPT, can people have sex after drinking? Because I thought to myself, well, this is a tool that's available across the US to anyone, educators, students, youth alike. I'm not going to read it all here. I just want to highlight a couple points in yellow that ChatGPT said to me. So can people have sex after drinking? It's not recommended to have sex after drinking or while under the influence of drugs. So bam, immediately it gives you that hesitancy language that we should be avoiding this. It goes on to say, it's important to be aware that if someone is intoxicated, they may not be able to give informed consent, which means that engaging in sexual activity with them can be considered sexual assault or rape. So here, ChatGPT highlights the fact that alcohol can impair my ability to give consent, and that can result in a sexual assault. And finally, if you choose to drink alcohol or use drug, it's important to be aware of your own limits and to communicate clearly with your partner or partners about your boundaries and intentions. So here it finishes up with saying that if you do end up doing this, we need to be mindful of one another and communicating clearly with one another. And so when I think about the fact this is an open AI software, I mean, these are pretty comprehensive approaches that could just be another avenue of education and resource when we're at a time where we're finding it's difficult to do those things in the classroom or around others. And with that, Alex and I would love to open this up and answer any questions or hear from you all about this and kind of what you're dealing with. Thank you so much.
This was really great. Thank you both so much. This is more of a comment than a question, but I'm just thinking about how this was a topic of conversation. I remember explicitly in grad school, having conversations with my male peers and them just being like totally aghast, not aghast, but just like confused about how we were out partying and drinking, and yet there was like, they felt like that nobody could consent to having sex with them, or that's what they were being told anyway. And so this, I think this like allows for a lot more nuance which, you know, there's rarely black and white in any conversation that we have. But I wish that we were having these conversations, you know, however long ago that was, that I was like 12, 13, 14 years ago when I was in grad school. And so anyway, I appreciate the research that y'all are doing, and this was really interesting to me.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think I think the issue is that it is nuanced. And then if you think about prevention, right, or education, it's tough to have a nuanced message go out on a large scale, right?
Yeah.
It's a very difficult kind of campaign to make, right? It is much easier to just say that, like, you can't do this when you're drinking. And from a public health perspective, I do understand that. Like, I can't imagine the message that goes like, well, you can consent sometimes, maybe
Right.
2 to 3, but not really.
Yeah.
And so it is difficult for that, but that's where I think our job is, like in the classroom or when we're educating, to have these opportunities for that more nuanced conversation there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
I
great.
hear a lot. Yeah, I was gonna say, I hear a lot of fear out of my like male peers in terms of, you know, they're nervous of, you know, like in Dr. Marcantonio's quotes, like, if I do this, will she wake up and say this? Or, you know, I don't want to make a wrong step. And then I don't know how to address that. Like, I've had conversations with my male peers of, you know, how should I ask for consent? And, you know, what should that look like? And I'm glad that they're asking, and I'm glad that my friends are curious about these things, but not many people and adult figures in our lives have really come forward and helped us with those kinds of conversations. That's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to highlight, there's a couple questions in the chat. So from Courtney, wonderful presentation. Thanks so much for the information. Question regarding the studies of the dyads. Were those questions asked in front of their friend or alone?
Yeah, great question. So we separate them. So they get separated from one another, and then we ask them out of earshot at the tailgate. That's a good question.
Awesome. And then from Jay, is there any data on consent/non-consent amongst more LGBTQ population that correlates with newer trends, such as what is referred to as cruising or anything such as that?
Yeah, so I would say that consent within LGBTQ populations is something that's, like, I would say, really on the rise right now. So I would tell you that broadly, it can look similar. There are a couple of differences in how consent's communicated in an LGBTQ encounter, particularly if we're thinking about two men. So a big thing that comes up with consent between two men versus, say, like men and women, is that you see more conversation around like positioning. So instead of saying things like, do you want to have sex? You might see more often in a same gender with two men about like topping or bottoming and kind of comfort with that. You do also see more conversations and more cues that are described as kind of like preparatory behavior. So like lubrication, condom use, thinking about anal sex there. So it does look a little different from like the explicit verbal side because the behavior looks slightly different. Non-consent, I actually think that what I have seen so far is that it looks similar across everyone. And that's because nobody likes to refuse verbally. Like regardless of who you're with, people tend to refuse non-verbally. And that seems to go across same gender and opposite gender encounters. And I think that's just because a larger norm. It's just embarrassing. It's difficult. People don't like rejection. So that one seems to cut across. I will say I haven't seen as much with women who have sex with women. I did interview some people who identified as bisexual for the study, and some of them were women. And women did actually tell me that they felt safer in their encounters with women, and that they were more likely to use verbal cues in their encounters with women because they felt more comfortable with them than when they had sex with men. And so I think more work has to be done in this area because there are clearly some nuances that come up, and it's not a one-to-one. Great question, Jay.
I have a question. I have two questions. Sort of one is building off of the question around the friends being around for the interview. Like, so I guess it's more about like methodology and the science of the study. Like, how do you sort of see yourself as a researcher asking the questions, and how that might like influence people's answer because of like the social pressure, like because of sex positivity? Like, I feel like young people go from high school where there's no comprehensive sex ed, and like if there is any, it's like you know, abstinence only, don't have sex is horrible. And then they get to college and there's all of a sudden this social norm that like you have to be engaging in sex to be like cool or something like that. So like, how do you, I guess my first question is like, how do you sort of navigate that in the questioning? And do you think that that is involved in people's answers? And then my second question is, I guess, sort of similar, like how do like gender roles or different gendered expectations sort of influence the research or the like ability to consent?
Yeah. Alex, do you want to say anything about the gender role one first? I don't know if you have any thoughts first.
Sure. So I would say as far as gender roles, I'm trying to think about my own personal experiences. And I would say, especially the first part of your question where you asked about like coming from high school to college, my first thought on that is in my conversations with my peers, I feel like the best way to approach it is being very conversational, because I think the biggest thing is people feel afraid, especially men feel afraid to come forward and talk about, you know, like in being wrong or being in the wrong, I should say, not just wrong factually, but in the wrong in any situation. So I think between gender roles, the biggest thing is when I'm having conversations is to make sure that you're doing it in a way where somebody doesn't feel cornered or attacked or talked down to in any sort of way. I would say that would be the biggest thing. And I know that with my male friends in their male to male interactions, I know that a lot of them are like, we don't talk about anything. We don't talk about that. So that could be one gender role. Whereas I feel like girls tend to just kind of chat with their girlfriends about a lot more. So yeah, that's kind of the college perspective, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. So like, you know, when I think about gender roles and like just broadly the influence that has on consent, is that like what you're thinking, Megan? Yeah. So I mean, I call consent is a gendered phenomenon. Is at least historically how we've talked about it. I think when we talk about LGBTQ context, I try to take it out of that language. But if you think about it in a heterosexual context, it is deeply ingrained in traditional gender norms. As Alex suggested, I think that like the idea is like men ask, women give. And that really impacts consent. But I think thinking about gender roles and gender expectation also impacts how we interpret all of this. So when I think about like gender roles, think about the idea that like men pursue sex and that women's job is to play like coy or hard to get or token to protect like their virtue and not seem too interested. And so what does that tell men then? Men should keep asking, men should keep trying because women aren't sincere in their no's, they're not legitimate no's. When we know in fact that they are, more often women report they actually have to refuse 3 times before they're taken seriously by their partner, even though they reported on the first time they were serious. And when you ask men about this, they would tell you that it's because they think that she's not sincere. They think that it's her job is to refuse. And so when I think about the role that gender has in this, it has, in my opinion, a big role in interpretation of consent, but then also I think how that ends up increasing the risk for violence to happen because he thinks that he can keep asking or just pursue this because she will eventually give in. And so that's kind of how I see gender there. For the interview stuff, it's actually an interesting question of thinking about like, what role do I as like a researcher have in that maybe these people think that like whatever they might think, right, that I want them to say something or that I'm looking for a certain answer. I don't have a great answer to this. Something that like we're often told, right, is try to be very like mindful in how we ask a question to not pose any judgment to it. I can say for the interview study, when we did this, actually, it was with a bunch of undergrads who did it with me. And so they were more often their peers, as opposed to me. I'm a little older and much older now. And so they are folks who look like them. And ideally, hopefully they feel more comfortable, to be honest, as someone who is similar to them compared to like me as now like a 30-year-old adult asking this question does have a difference in age compared to a 19-year-old. But I think it's a good question in terms of something I'm always mindful of like, are people giving me the answers that I want, or are they being like honest in the things that they say to me? So great question, Megan.
Thank you, Caleb.
So there is another question in the chat. What or how would adults differ in giving consent when consuming alcohol? Also, what are ways that we can encourage adolescents and adults to educate themselves on consent?
Yeah. So for, how with adults, so I would tell you that, like, broadly speaking, a lot of this research, I think, caps off at like 25. And in fact, like, I just wrote a grant to do some of this, and I wrote the grant to do it with people from 18 to 50. And the response I actually got back was that this is something that you study past the age of 25. That it's just not, it's not the same issue that it is when they're younger. And so I would argue that there's really nothing. um, and clearly grant reviewers do not think it is worthy to study this beyond the young adult population.
Wow.
That's
Yeah.
mind blowing.
And we do know that like STI and STD rates are super high in elderly populations, especially those who are living in, community homes. So
this is a good lesson for all of us that, when research doesn't exist on these topics, it's not because people don't think that it should be studied. Sometimes it's in the hands of the funders. And oftentimes it's in the hand of the funders. So yeah, that's really disappointing to hear that they didn't find that worthy of consideration, because I think would be super interesting and helpful, and certainly is needed among older populations as well.
Yeah. It was
And I
was
know,
shocked.
yeah, no, you're fine. I know that a lot of my peers have a hard time, going to like what ways we can educate ourselves. A lot of my peers, there's a lot of like just stuff on social media that's out there that isn't always 100%, accurate or factual, or give you a comprehensive background of, what's going on, and a lot of it can be taken out of context. So you do have to be careful of where you're finding this information. And, sometimes I see things on my own For You page on TikTok and I'm like, wait a minute, I don't know. I don't know if that's completely accurate. So a good place to go would, be, of course, Planned Parenthood has a lot of great resources, on campuses, like the Women and Gender Resource Center here is a good avenue for us, which is great. And then, of course, there's the Tuscaloosa Safe Center, and there's a lot of on-campus programming as well. But in adult setting, you have to be careful of where you're searching online.
Yeah.
But I will say that I felt very heartened seeing some of the responses that y'all got, especially from the young men. Seems like it's catching on, which is great. Obviously in our work doing comprehensive sex ed, we would hope that it would be like in the younger, like even in high school, but even if they're finally picking it up in college, that's great.
Yeah.
Christina, I'm so glad you brought that up. This is Russ Davis from UWA. And I do believe that one of the biggest missing pieces from the male perspective is the idea that vulnerability, that need for care and connection is there. And it's just simply unavailable in the cultural model. Like, men the pursuer is one of the only options for engagement. And to hear other guys talk about and verbalize that need for connection, that how to navigate, like, and it's going to sound bad, but most men need to turn somebody down, and we don't have the language or the skills to be able to do that. Like, that's not something in the socialization and the technique. All that's really given to us is go get more. And it's wonderful to hear your findings that can give voice to that reality, because it lets guys have something to connect to other than the Fonzie approach that I got raised on. You think 30's old, man, try 50.
Yes, I see that in my peers a lot. My male peers, they don't know how to reject somebody, or if something, I've seen my friends be in situations in local bars where, a girl is coming onto them and they're uncomfortable and they don't know what to do, because they don't want to be seen as the guy where, he was rude to her in the bar, and then she tells all of her friends that he was rude. But, when somebody's breaking your personal boundary, he's like, I don't know how to handle that, because it's never been taught to him. Refusals never taught to them.
Absolutely. Like, that's, and I think that kind of moves masculinity more centered to sex as an option, sex as something that's important to you, protect you from, protect other people from. And yeah, fantastic findings there. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Any final words, thoughts? We're just a minute past, and I know some folks are popping off, and that's perfectly fine. Well, thank you both so much, Alex and Dr. Marcantonio.
Thank you.
We would love to have you back at some point to talk more about this. It's such a necessary topic. So thank you. And everyone have a great rest of your day.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks,
you.
everybody.
Bye.